So following Silicon Valley and Signature Bank's collapse and also troubles suffered by Credit Suisse, will fears in bank sector spread even more widely? Will we see a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis, and how will this impact Indonesia? To discuss more, we are joined by Teguh Wicaksono, who is the head of the Mandiri Institute. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Right. So first of all, let's start with the situation in Europe. The CEO of Credit Suisse said that Silicon Valley Bank's contagion will be contained. Eurogroup president says there is not a direct exposure between Europe's banking system and Silicon Valley Bank. But as I mentioned just now, Credit Suisse is now in trouble. Their shares surged again this morning, but they are essentially being bailed out. So do you think this is the start of a global contagion from the US and now to Europe?
Well, I think it's really important to see the causes of this, what happens in these two banks. And from what I know is like the situations are really extremely different. I mean, like the story about the Credit Suisse is more about the story of losing investor confidence in terms of, the bank's management. Meanwhile, on SVB, I think we see about the losses on the long-term securities that that they have, SVB has. So from the perspective of balance sheet, I think the Swiss bank balance sheet was fine, but it has really serious problems with their reputations. I mean, there have been a lot of scandal from its top management and Woobly investment banking unit, if we remember last year. So even it cannot manage its strongest unit, which is wealth management that rely on reputations, right? So what happened with Credit Suisse is like their profitability plunged and the bank's deposit also fell. So that's the thing happening with Swiss bank. On the other hand, SVB's collapse has been due to typical bank run in which startups they are the largest depositors in SVBs, and their funds dried up, so they started pulling their cash, their money for their operating expenses. And the problem is like SVB doesn't hold that much cash, so they start looking ways to meet its customers' withdrawals, right? And they ask authorities to support them. So in a nutshell, I'd like to say that given these two different causes, I think this is not an indication of a global contagion, but of course, what happens in on these two banks send jittery to the global financial markets.
Right, as you said just now, send jitters to the global market. I mean, explain the depth of those jitters. Will it go towards being a global contagion in the global banking sector, as we saw maybe in 2008?
Well, I think I saw there are some differences if we compare between what happened in the global financial crisis in 2008 with what happens now. I mean, like in the 2008, I think the crisis was due to reckless investment strategies, right, by financial players, including banks, in which they put a lot of money on highly leveraged, investments such as subprime mortgage. And as the name mentioned, subprime mortgage is very risky assets and very highly leveraged. So that's the story in 2008. Meanwhile, on what happened on SVB's bank, on the other hand, is like the bank somehow cannot adjust very quickly or cannot anticipate the impact of rising interest rate on their deposits. If we go back perhaps in the early time of the pandemic, I think that's the problem began. I mean, like during that period, there was investment boom because the government do the quantitative easing, and a lot of money flushed to the bank. So some numbers, like for instance, like at the time, SVB was flooded by almost 130 billion in new deposits between 2020 and 2021. So they had a problem how to lend this out, right? Because so much money at the time. And as a result, they invested much of this money in long-term US government-backed bonds. And the bonds, of course, have no credit risk. And also SVB's deposit costs almost nothing. They pay only a small amount of money. But the problem starts when, the Fed raise interest rate,
Yeah.
and the venture capital start to reallocate their investment to other things, and startups dry up funding. So this balanced structure that SVBs had can only work while rates remain low. When the Federal Reserve, battle inflation with, rising interest rate, then, deposit become more expensive. I think that's the story with SVBs, Krishna.
Right. But so let's just clarify your stance on this. Do you see the chances of a global contagion being high or not at all? And do you see any other global banks sort of getting into trouble now following SVB's collapse?
Well, I think we should remain cautious. I mean, like, for saying there is no impact will be too optimistic. But
Right.
again, this of course create uncertainties with, with people or investors start to guess which banks might have collapse again. But so far, if I look at on the, the position and also the systemic risk, particularly on the big banks, I think uh, particularly the impact of on Indonesia, I think quite limited at the moment. But again, I think we need time to see how this crisis will fold it in the next few months or few weeks.
Right. So what kind of risks potentially could you see it impacting Indonesia?
Well, I think first about the investor confidence. Like, this is important to manage the investor confidence when they start, like, questioning of this, in particular Indonesian banks' ability to manage fund. I think it's really, dangerous. But again, if you look at on the current situation of the Indonesian bank, I think Indonesia banking sector remain resilient. So, for instance, like, if you look at the credit growth, I think by February, if I'm not mistaken, still grew by double digit, around 10.6%. And liquidity remain loose. For instance, like the Bank Indonesia kept the interest rate at the same rate. So basically, we see that it gives signal that the confidence from our monetary and also our regulatory authorities that the bank remain resilient in terms of the conditions. So and also, if we heard about the Pak Peri's statement today, Bank Indonesia already conducted some sort of a stress test to assess the impact of this turmoil. I think from his statement, I think he's pretty sure that our banking is under a quite well shaped.
Right. So you're still confident that the impact to Indonesia will be minimal, but as we know, President Joko Widodo, he urged caution and to continue monitoring the situation. Now, I want to ask you about startups because, as you mentioned earlier, Silicon Valley Bank catered mostly to startups. What impact will that have on Indonesian startups and the tech sector in Indonesia? Could this be worrying for them at all?
Oh yeah, I think the winter season for startup is coming. I mean, it's actually was coming since last year. Yeah. So for instance, like, in the earth pandemic, there are a lot of funds, so they invest heavily on the capital. They did like heavy capital investment, but by the time when the global monetary authority started to do the policy normalization, then their funds started to dry up. So I think this is the problem, and I think since last year we have seen a lot some big startups starting to lay off their employees, and I feel like this trend might still continue. So this is very tough time for startups and also tech companies.